Wow. Wonderful. Welcome all to this seminar about gender dysphoria. We are in Gothenburg at the Nordic meeting of ICMDA. And my name is Jovanna Dahlgren, and I'm the moderator. And we have the honor to have with us at Zoom Peter Saunders, that is the CEO of ICMDA. And he will give you mainly a lecture, but I will just show you some slides just as an introduction. So for you that did not be here yesterday, the first day, Dr. Peter Saunders is trained as a general surgeon in New Zealand before serving as a missionary doctor in Kenya. And he served for almost 30 years within the Christian Medical Fellowship of the UK. And his currently work involves leadership training, teaching evangelism and ethics, medical mission, writing, editing, and media work. And he has written some wordings. See if I can manage to, you can look at some links. You can Google and find a lot written by Peter Saunders. This slide shows you the situation in Sweden. This is from Läkartidningen and shows the development over the last 2 decades about gender dysphoria. And in my pediatric community, because I'm a pediatric endocrinologist and we deal with these patients in the university hospitals, we say that it's an almost 1,000% increase in this disease, which is enormous. And it's discussed also the entity rapid onset gender dysphoria that could be one of the reasons, and that this is really a social thing, that we see that in some schools it's like a pandemic. We know today that a lot of these kids have identity queries, and that a lot of them have neuropsychiatric disorders, and that will influence very badly on quality of life, both before doing surgery and after. So in Sweden today we have patients that have done suicide after surgery. But it's a very hot topic that is really very much debated, and we need, as Christians, God's wisdom when we discuss and deal with these things. So it has to be a discussion with facts and discussion with respect. Just 3 years ago, Swedish Agency for Health Technology Assessment came with a review. And they showed low evidence of the long-term outcome and several issues that were very worrying. And you can get the review, the whole review, at the website. I just showed you one slide before showing what happened this year. So in the literature, there are very few randomized studies. I would say almost none. but they are retrospective studies showing, especially from Holland. And I will show you just some numbers here from 2 transgender studies, large studies. And they show an increased risk of stroke, of myocardial infarction, of venous thromboembolism, and it's a bit different if you are a trans woman or a trans man. But still, these things are not communicated to the public. And when I talk with transgender persons, they're not really aware of these things. So that is a fact that has to be communicated and respectfully discussed. And we have done a lot of discussions within the Pediatric Endocrine Society. So this year, the 1st of May, Svante Nordgren is the head of Karolinska Hospital, Astrid Lindgren, the pediatric part of that, announced that they, as hospitals, stop all new hormone treatment in children with gender dysphoria due to a lack of evidence. And they said that they want randomized trials and need much more facts before entering and offering this as a usual treatment. And I can say that this was a mega bomb, because what happened was that the people that decided this have been threatened very much. So in a way, it's a bit chaotic situation, I would say in several countries, but especially in Sweden, where it's really a lot of emotions instead of facts that guide us as clinicians. So I will stop now sharing, and hope we have contact with Peter Saunders, because he will give you the lecture about the facts. Peter? Yes. Hello, Peter. Welcome.
Hello, thank you very much, Jovanna, for your introduction. And you're right that this is a topic that generates a huge amount of heat, and it's very difficult to stand up in public and go against the prevailing view. I gave a talk to the Family and Youth Concern, which is a British charity, about 3 or 4 years ago at their annual general meeting, and it went up on YouTube on this whole subject, and it had 160,000 views on YouTube. And then someone complained to YouTube, and the video was removed. And if you go there today, you just see that this video was removed because it constituted hate speech. So that's the kind of thing we're up against. Let me just make my screen visible. Hopefully you can see that now. So what I'm going to do with this talk is firstly look at some of the very recent cases in the UK and US, things that have happened just this very week, and then I'll talk about the evolution of this whole debate in the UK, and then talk about how the tide turned against the transgender revolution, what the ingredients of that were, and then we'll look back at gender dysphoria and some of the Christian analysis and practical implications. So let's see how we go. But this was a huge headline that came out this week in Britain. The Scottish government will let pupils change their gender aged 4 without their parents' consent, and tells teachers not to question a child's request to choose a different name or use a different toilet. And there was a huge reaction against this from almost all of the newspapers, but the Scottish government is really at a very extreme end of this debate. And also this week, there was a judgment from a federal court in the US. President Obama, under his Obamacare program, had required that doctors be involved in transgender treatments, and that if they didn't, they would face financial penalties or restrictions on their work. And this was overturned by the Trump government, but then Biden reinstituted it, and then it went to court, and the Christian Medical and Dental Association, our member body in the US, went up against this, and the Biden judgment was overturned again. So they're going to appeal. That's about conscience issues. And then in the UK, we had this case of Maya Forstater, who was a woman who lost her job because she had said on Twitter that people cannot change their biological sex. And she went to a tribunal. She was told by the judge that her views were not acceptable in a democratic society. She lost her job, and then she appealed, and eventually she won back her case. And so there's been a real turning of the tide there. And then most recently, we've had the case of Kira Bell, who was a woman who had sought transgender treatment as a teenager, and then later wanted to detransition, and then brought a court case against the Tavistock Clinic in London, which carried out her treatment to stop the prescribing of puberty blockers. And she was successful in that. And so the main clinic, the Tavistock Clinic in London, can no longer prescribe puberty blockers to children under 16. But of course, as you'd expect, that is being appealed again. So there'll be a further court case. So it's these cases are just evidence of the huge amount of recrimination and debate that is going on. So let's just think about this huge transgender phenomenon. This was the front page of Time magazine just a few years ago, the transgender tipping point. And it's generally accepted that the real game changer in this was when Bruce Jenner, now known as Caitlyn Jenner, who initially won a gold medal in the decathlon for the US, changed gender and appeared on the front cover of Vanity Fair. And that really made it a mainstream cultural issue. And then, of course, there have been lots of other things in the media or in the worlds of entertainment. The Danish Girl film was a good example of a well-known actor, Eddie Redmayne in Britain, who played this person who first had a sex change operation in Europe many years ago. And then it just seemed that the whole world had gone mad very quickly. We had Facebook offering 71 different gender options to UK users, and you might say, well, what are these? Here are some of them. You'll recognize the male and female icons in the top left-hand corner, but most of the rest are a mystery to all of us. But this whole idea that there were over 70 different genders, and that one could choose what their gender was, and that a person could even be multi-gendered, switching from one to another. And then we saw some bizarre things. Germaine Greer was a leading feminist, very outspoken, radical speaker, and then she got barred from Cardiff University. She was not able to speak there because she said that trans women were not real women. And then there was the case of this Oxford teacher who referred to a group of children as girls, but one of them identified as a boy, and so her parents complained and he lost his job in Oxford just through misgendering, using the wrong pronoun to describe this child. And then in the medical world, of course, we've seen a change in the way that this condition is thought about. Under the DSM-4 in 2000, it was referred to as gender identity disorder. This was certainly the case when I trained. And then in the DSM-5, the term was changed to gender dysphoria. And this represented a shift in emphasis from gender incongruence, if you like, where there's incongruence between a person's biological sex and what they believe they are as a disorder to a focus on the distress associated with it. So it wasn't a problem unless there was distress. In other words, it was seen increasingly as a natural variant. And this change was strongly ideologically driven, not driven by evidence, but it then came into the medical literature. And we published this at Christian Medical Fellowship back in 2004. You can see the date there, but of course, when we updated it, we used all the new terms that are now in vogue. This is spring of 2016. And you just have to look through the medical institutions to see how the whole view of the medical profession changed. So this was a document put out by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and you can see the date, October 2013, Good Practice Guidelines for the Assessment and Treatment of Adults with Gender Dysphoria. And this had the endorsement of all of these medical societies, I think most of whom had never read it and were not aware of its contents. But it was amazing how the whole medical profession seemed to shift to adopt this new way of thinking as part of this whole cultural wave that was taking place. And our regulatory body, the General Medical Council, similarly started publishing huge amounts of information on advice for doctors supporting transgender patients. And you can see the word there, supporting. So it was very much an affirmative approach that people who identify as being another gender than their biological sex, the default position is that you help them to change their gender, whether that involves hormones or surgery or cross-dressing or whatever. And so we had this proliferation of guidance. And of course, this made it very difficult for doctors who had any reservations about this or who felt that the former nomenclature around gender identity disorder was a more accurate description of what we were really dealing with. And as in Sweden, we began to see a huge and exponential increase in referrals to gender identity clinics, of which the leading one was the Tavistock Clinic in London. And so you'll see a lot of graphs like this. The interesting thing about this over the 2010 to 2016 period was that whereas previously most transgender patients had been boys, there was an increase in the number of girls. And this phenomenon that Jovanna's already mentioned about rapid onset gender dysphoria seemed to be playing a big part in that, so that groups of girls of teenage age were transitioning together or identifying together in groups as being boys. And you can see the figures here. Some of these children coming to the clinic were as young as 3. There were quite a few below teenage, but the biggest group were in the teenage block of the 13 to 17-year-olds. And so the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust Gender Identity Development Service, it was called. You can see the numbers here in the year up to 2006, March 2016, 1,400 children referred, double that of the year before. The mode age was 16. The main increase was in the 14 plus age group, but there were 167 children aged 10 or under who'd been referred to clinics. And these included 3 children aged 3. So we see this extraordinary cultural phenomenon beginning with the Caitlyn Jenner story, then spreading into a different way of medical thinking, and then this huge increase in referrals. What was going on? And the clinic followed this 4-stage process. First of all, the identity of transgender was recognized, puberty blockers if they were under the teenage ages, and then sex change hormones once they came to the teenage period, and then if people requested it, gender assignment surgery as well. And even the church, the church often sadly reflects the culture, and we had stories like this. The first gender non-binary pastor in Brighton, you know the UK, you'll know that Brighton is a real stronghold of LGBT, very large population down there on the south coast. And then the Church of England seemed to have lost its tongue as well and wanted to go in the same direction that the culture was going on quite uncritically. So here we have Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, says he has no problem with girls and dresses. And then, of course, it wasn't long until the push for legal change came. So there was a group called the Women Equalities Committee in the House of Commons, our lower house, which produced this report on transgender equality. And this was their agenda. They wanted to lower the age of gender recognition from 18 to 16 and 17-year-olds to allow the use of puberty blockers for children and cross-sex hormones for teenagers, and then also the non-gendering of official records like passports as well. And a lot of this was driven by one Conservative MP, Justine Greening, from the Cambridge area, who was in a very powerful position because she had two portfolios. She was Secretary of State, both for education and for women and equalities. And also she identified as a lesbian as well. And so it seemed almost that there was overwhelming pressure and that the law was going to change. So choose your own gender without seeing a doctor. So the idea was that purely on the basis of self-identification, people could change their gender, obtain hormones, and that anyone standing in the way, be they a doctor or otherwise, would be in great trouble. And so really up until what I call the turning point in Britain, which was December 2017, it looked like the law was going to change, that it would be very difficult for Christians and others questioning the new status quo to continue in medicine without being forced to be involved, that legislation was coming, and it seemed there was very little resistance in Parliament. And then all of a sudden, mysteriously, on Christmas Day in 2017, this article came out. Very few people saw it because they were celebrating Christmas. But rethink over new law that will allow adults to swap gender without consulting a doctor after minister gets cold feet. And so what had happened here, well, very quickly after that, Justine Greening was sacked by the Prime Minister, Theresa May. We don't know exactly why this was, but it seemed to have something together with this, this push that she was making for change over transgender. The LGBT activists were very angry about this, understandably, and the tide had turned. And I think there were a number of factors that led to people start to question this new revolution. First of all, there was opposition from feminist groups and from lesbian and gay groups who were particularly worried about so-called trans women, biological men who claimed they were women, and there'd been several episodes of violence or abuse involving these people. And in particular, feminist groups had come under attack and been labeled as TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. And there were actually fisticuffs and, between some of these trans women and so on. So that raised questions. There were concerns about the undermining of civil liberties, people losing the opportunity to speak freely or hold opinions or practice medicine. And then doctors started to question the use of puberty blockers in children on the basis that Jovanna was just raising. Was there really any evidence that it was the appropriate treatment? And then there was data about three things: cessation, people initially identifying as the other gender, but then ceasing to do so as they grew up through childhood; detransitioning, like the case of Kira Bell, where people had undergone gender change therapy and then had felt that it wasn't appropriate and wanted to change back again, and then the whole phenomenon of ROGD, the rapid onset gender dysphoria. And there was a meeting in Parliament at the end of 2017 where a member of Parliament, this man here, David Davis, MP, and I actually went to this meeting and were involved in setting up this meeting, but he wanted on the panel people who were not evangelical Christians or conservatives, but actually were people far from that position, but who were greatly concerned about the whole transgender revolution. So he organized a leader of an organization called Transgender Trend, which was a parents' pressure group who were very concerned about their transgender kids and the way that they'd been excluded from having a say in their management. And then there was a woman who led a woman's refuge who was concerned about trans women assaulting people in prison and so on. And then there was a trans person who said this is just an ideology or religion, it's not a biological reality. And then there was a lecturer who wanted to do research into detransitioning in a British university, who'd been told that his work was genderphobic or that it was inappropriate. And so this MP assembled this list of people, and this is where the opinion started to change. And so we had articles like this: my daughter's not transgender, she's just a tomboy. And this was in the New York Times. Sex change regret. So these are people who'd had gender reversal, but then wanted their surgery reversed again. And the article in PLOS One of reporting the phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. So there were questions being raised. And then the new Equalities Minister, a couple of years later, was deeply concerned about the massive spike in trans referrals, and so ordered an inquiry into it. So it seemed that at all levels, people were starting to ask questions, even in the highest government as well. So when we talk about this whole issue, it's important that we distinguish two things. The first, a transgender ideology, which I put it as a false belief system attempting to shape morality, law, and society that needs to be met with dispassionate refutation. But on the other hand, gender dysphoria, a rare but real and distressing medical condition that needs to be met with compassionate understanding. And so as doctors, we need to be to wear both hats here. We need to be intellectually rigorous in our refutation of false belief, but also compassionate and kind to patients. And where did all these ideas come from? This is a Planned Parenthood advert, and the point of this is that they're arguing that there are three different phenomena. There's first of all gender identity, and that's what you think you are, and that's all to do with your brain. And then secondly, there's sexual orientation, which is about who you experience erotic attraction to, whether you're straight, gay, bisexual, asexual, and so on. And then there's biological sex, male, female, or intersex. And these three things, gender identity, sexual orientation, and biological sex, don't necessarily go together. They could be any combination at all in a person. And so this was the idea that there was a disconnect between these three entities altogether. And if you want to trace this thinking way back and its roots, then I think one of the best books on this is The Global Sexual Revolution by Gabriel Kubi. And we're just going through this very quickly, but we have seen, as Glyn Harrison, psychiatrist, Christian psychiatrist in Britain, says, in less than a generation, the Christian moral vision that human beings flourish when sexual interests are boundaried in lifelong covenant made between a man and a woman, i.e. marriage, has seen a profound loss of cultural power. And often what is whispered in university ivory towers in one generation gets shouted in the streets in the next generation. And this was certainly the case with this, because if we trace the academic and intellectual roots, the whole transgender ideology has its roots in three main things: radical feminism, the whole idea of throwing off the male yoke or bondage; Gnosticism, liberating the authentic inner you, which has roots right back to, of course, to the first century; and then queer theory, the idea that gender categories are simply just social constructions, that they are not anything in reality, and that we need to free the human spirit from shame and prejudice and hate. And of course, very powerful narratives which support this in documentary and film, drama and television and so on. And so we had these three waves of feminism. The first wave focused on giving women the vote, the second on employment rights, job security, and so on. I think very few people have any difficulties. Most people are strongly supportive of the first two waves of feminism and Western culture. But the third wave was much more radical, and it was focused on changing societal norms, the way people think, and removing from power those who were seen to impose these societal norms. So this call to smash heteronormativity, as they called it. And the people involved in this, Simone de Beauvoir, a very famous academic feminist, one is not born but rather becomes a woman. So the idea is that being a woman is not a biological reality, but it's something that you can become. And of course, you may choose not to become it. But the real academic who laid the framework for this was Judith Butler in her book, Gender Trouble. And she was really the architect of queer theory, which got into the universities and then into mainstream culture. So the idea that man and woman are just myths, that they're not real, that they're social constructs, and that we need to undermine and shake and unsettle the beliefs propagated primarily by the church and other authorities in culture. So this is where queer theory came from. So of course, we recognize the difference between biological sex, determined by chromosomes, external genitalia, hormones, and so on. Gender, which is about the psychological, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. And then gender identity is what you feel or think you are when you think about yourself. So we'll know these biological realities of chromosomal sex, genetic sex, leading to hormonal sex, androgens or estrogens, gonadal sex, both male and female, and then the various effects on the brain that are there, which manifest themselves in different kinds of behavior. And we need to start first by affirming that intersex is something completely different than gender dysphoria, because in gender dysphoria, there are no abnormalities of any of these things from chromosomes through to hormones. But in intersex, there's a whole range of conditions where, of course, there are abnormalities, either from androgen exposure in XX females, or under-masculinized males for various reasons, or of course true gonadal intersex where there's a chromosomal abnormality. And of course there are a whole range of different intersex conditions which can be diagnosed, but they have nothing to do with gender dysphoria. But still there's a lot of confusion in churches and in the general public about that. So gender dysphoria is about incongruence between your biological sex on the one hand and your sense of gender identity on the other. What causes it? Well, we don't know. It's probably a combination between nature and nurture, biological and behavioral factors. But we know in most people it's not chosen. Initially extremely rare, but becoming much more common, and it raises the question about whether social forces and contagion are operating. Its natural course in adults. Many people, when they start cross-gender treatment, don't finish it, and yet most gender dysphoria doesn't resolve with psychological treatment either. And for 25%, the outcome of surgery is not positive. In children, gender incongruence is not uncommon. So you can see the percentages there for higher in girls than boys. A large percentage of GI boys will develop same or bisex attraction. Similarly, for girls, not quite as high. But this is a striking stat that 80 to 95% of children presenting with gender dysphoria choose to stay in their birth sex. So it seems to be largely, for most people, a temporary phenomenon. But with late teenagers, it's much higher that they will stay. And as Jovanna's mentioned already, the neurodevelopmental disorders, so the autism spectrum disorders, is higher levels in kids with gender dysphoria. But then also there are the associated problems of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, suicidality. So some of the papers here, 28 cross-sectional studies with psychopathology and psychiatric disorders higher than in non-trans populations. Suicide attempts 10 times the rate found in the overall population. And then the biggest study that's ever been done was this 30-year study in Sweden, where the suicide rate was 19 times higher among transgender adults than among the non-gender population. Here it is on PLOS ONE, published back in 2011. And so the evidence started to be developed. I think this new Atlantis special report is well worth getting. And the major conclusions of this that came out about 10 years ago that that the understanding of sexual orientation is an innate, biologically fixed property of human beings. The idea that people are born that way is not supported by the scientific evidence when we're talking about sexual orientation. That compared to the general population, non-heterosexual subpopulations are at an elevated risk for a number of adverse health and mental health outcomes. And the hypothesis that gender identity is an innate fixed property of human beings that's independent of biological sex, that a woman might be a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa, is not supported by the scientific evidence. And so we're left with this fundamental question of what is gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder? Is it a normal variant, as we're being told, or is it a form of body dysmorphia, like a mental disorder characterized by an obsessive preoccupation that some aspect of one's appearance is severely flawed and warrants exceptional measures to hide or fix it? Is it, person feels that their facial features need changing and they need surgery? Is it like that? Or is it like anorexia nervosa, where a person has a false belief about their body leading to radical attempts to change it through dieting? And I think that's quite an interesting analogy. You have perhaps a teenage girl who believes she's fat, although she's thin, but she's dieting as a result. And of course, we don't give people in that category liposuction. But if gender identity disorder is really like this, that it's a false belief about one's body, then that would be a very powerful argument not to be making the medical interventions for what is really a problem of thinking. And so, of course, how you think about these things depends on your approach. Do we alter the body to conform to the gender identity through hormones or transgender surgery? Or do we alter the identity to conform to the body? Do we help people to be reconciled to the body that they have through counseling and psychotherapy? Or should we just support the person in their conflicted state? And of course, that's a huge debate in itself. But this is the key question. Is a person with gender identity disorder really a man in a woman's body or vice versa? Or are they just a woman or a man with a false belief that they are the other gender? So again, just a reminder that we have to think about these two different entities. Firstly, an ideology, a false belief system that we need to reject. But secondly, a group of people with real and distressing problems that we need to treat compassionately, and that we need to hold these things in balance. So just a few final Christian reflections, and then I'll stop. How can we share the mind of Christ, hold his commands, show his character, and carry his cross? And the Bible, of course, at one level is unashamedly binary. We're told God created mankind in their own image. male and female, he created them. And so you get these various scriptures about altering the body, about wearing inappropriate clothes, and yet at the same time, a recognition that there are people who are eunuchs or it's interesting, Jesus talks about these three categories: people who are made that way, born that way, people who've been made that way by men, and those who choose to live that way. And there's very interesting literature in Isaiah which talks about the inclusivity of the gospel for people who've been damaged in all sorts of ways, coming into God's kingdom and being welcomed there. And so it's about costly compassion towards conflicted people, but also costly faithfulness to the truth against opposition. And so we need to see it through the eyes of creation, that the Bible is unashamedly binary, but that there are over 6,000 genes which are expressed differently in men and women, but also appreciate that we live in a fallen world where we're all sinners affected by sin, where we expect phenomena like transgender and intersex to be in this world, and recognize that full healing might not be possible in this world, like for many, many other things, and that the personal experience of transgender can be very painful, and that churches need to be welcoming and redemptive communities. So on the one hand, not capitulating to transgender ideology, but also grasping the gospel opportunities that are there to show love and compassion to people. Now I'm going to just stop at that point because we're short of time. But let me just mention a few things. There's some good stuff, I think, on the CMF UK website that you'll find, the CMF file. I think the best book on this whole area to get a good grasp on everything from the law to history to what academics are saying to the psychology, medicine, and so on is this one by Ryan Anderson, an American lawyer, When Harry Became Sally. And the interesting thing about this book is that it was a bestseller, but then Amazon got a complaint about it and they removed it. So you can no longer buy it on Amazon, but if you can find it through a different source, I think this is a great book to read on this, some of the other things that are useful. So back to you, Jovanna. It's a very rapid overview of where we're at, not just looking at some of the medical aspects, but also at the cultural, philosophical, legal aspects and the way the debate has moved. But I think overall what I'm saying is that our impression is that in the UK, there has been a turning of the tide. And whereas it seemed it was all going in one direction, things are really starting to change now with more and more groups of people, not just Christians, asking questions about this whole phenomenon.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think it was extremely valuable and comprehensive, and I appreciate especially the cultural view of this. And you need to understand the things that happen, because as an endocrinologist, we are supposed to just do what our employers say. So we just have to treat, and I have met horrible things in very small kids, and we will discuss, and maybe later I could share that with you. But the important thing also that can complete a bit the interesting topic that Peter shared with us is that you can treat kids with blockers from an early age to avoid entering puberty. And pediatrician says that it has been debated that you need to enter puberty to really find your identity, gender identity. So in a way, it's you damage your bone density by doing that blocker, and you also, in a way, disturb the development of your puberty. And then when you treat with hormones that are contradictory to your genetic gender, you will have these effects that you have to treat, first of all your life. And I don't think everybody understands that this is a treatment for every day, all your life, future life. And then the treatment by itself gives you a huge risk for stroke and infarction and so on. So these things have to be really exposed. Okay, we had some questions from Peter, didn't we? So maybe we could really discuss this. I think we are in a way out of time a bit. I look at Magnus Langring about the time, but I think it was very, very important to let Peter show us all these slides and not cut in and away, because this is really a hot topic today. So what do you think, Magnus? Do we have a quarter?
Half an hour.
Good. Half an hour, good. So let us be discussing in small groups of 4 or 5, and then coming back within 15 minutes. Will you be there also, Peter?
Yeah, I can stay here, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Men hör han inte? Now, thank you. So, pardon, the technician said that you didn't hear everything, Peter, but the suggestion is that those of you that are in the Zoom can go out to breakout rooms, including Peter. Otherwise, you, Peter, can come back within 15 minutes, but we will reunion all within 15 minutes. Thank you. So maybe we should start with those at Zoom. Unmute if you have any question. We start there, and then we will have questions from the from here, from Gothenburg later on.
This is Tor Husby from Norway. Can you hear me? I would just like to ask Saunders, what will be our Christian strategy? Will it be a compassionate dialogue like the Church of England, or an ideological confrontation? With this new extreme ideology?
I think it depends very much on the context. So, you know, if you're in the consultation room as a pediatrician or a family practitioner, you know, dealing with someone with a transgender issue, then obviously you're going to approach it in a very gentle, compassionate, evidence-based way, and you'll want to be doing what you believe is right for the patient, and even if that involves doing something that they don't want you to do. So I think we've got to be really well informed on the medical facts, and we have to be very clear about what we believe this phenomenon is, and we have to be very clear biblically about the whole transgender ideology as well. So to think through that and know where we are. And then I think there are other contexts as well. There's the context of speaking with friends and family or others, where we have to be well informed and be able to put across our views with graciousness and sensitivity and respect. And then there is the more difficult public arena. And of course, we should be as gracious and accurate and evidence-based as we possibly can, but also realize that if this ideology really gets a foothold and starts to shape our laws and institutions, that it's going to be very, very bad indeed. So it does need to be confronted robustly. And I think that means not only knowing things, but having the courage to be able to put pen to paper, to go on the media, to make submissions to government and advise them. Because I think what we learned in the UK is that if you don't put up any resistance at all, it's not going to go away. It'll just overwhelmingly change everything in your whole society. And so you have to put up a fight. And yet it's a fight that Christians, I don't think, should be involved in alone. I think it's what we call a co-belligerent battle, where you come together with people who you may disagree with on a whole host of different issues, but you have the same view about this, that you're very concerned about the trend of transgender ideology and the way it's shaping society, undermining civil liberties, putting people in medical danger, capitulating to pressure groups and so on. And so I think it's important for us to work with with feminist groups, with lesbian and gay groups who are opposed to this, with lawyers, with other doctors who might not be Christian but are worried about what the evidence shows. So I think it depends very much on the context that we're in, but we need to wear those different hats.
Can I say
Thank
something?
you.
Yeah. I've been thinking about compassion, and in a lot of modern issues that we discuss, it's very liberal. But in my view, compassion as a doctor is to advocate for the vulnerable and advocate for medical security. And that means that, for example, when kids below the age of 1 enter our unit with, as it was, a female with high testosterone levels, with a micropenis, because two mothers, transgender mothers, believed that the child needed to have both hormones to choose the gender later on, is really medical unsecure. You can imagine that this child had an advanced bone age and so on and so on. So it has a lot of consequences that are dramatic. Should we just go further with those that are here? Maybe you have a question. Can you come in front and just ask your questions? Come.
Yes, could there be some unidentified, unknown environmental factors affecting the fetus's brain to a point that their future psychiatric development, neurological development is affected in some way that affects? So this is not just a sociological phenomenon, it's also some unknown factors in the environment.
Well, as a pediatric endocrinologist, I would say no. What I mean is that we know in pediatrics that we have intersex disorders where you have very high testosterone levels in a female in the womb because of enzyme defect. And those don't have any identity confusion. I mean, a lot of them are playing with boys and may have homosexual sexuality later on and so on, but it's not really that confusion. Do you have any experience, Peter, if it could be something in the environment that enhances these things?
I think absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as we say. So, but I'm not aware of of anything. You're in a much better position to comment on this than me because it's not my field. But I think it's useful to think about this whole phenomenon in terms of it being a complex product of genetics and environment and personal choice as well, that there are all sorts of factors which play a part to make it more likely that someone might end up with gender dysphoria. But what we do know is that there's no evidence that this is like the intersex conditions where there are real measurable differences or changes in chromosomes or androgens or sensitivity of end organs to sex hormones and so on. To all intents and purposes, it seems that all these things are normal and that it's much more a sociological, environmental thing. And we know, especially with ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria, that contagion or influence from a peer group plays a huge role. And of course, children are very suggestible as well. If they've got parents who are affirming their ambiguous feelings, then they're much more likely to end up believing them themselves.
Thank you. And I know that in your group here, you were saying that the modern way of looking at females is in a way restricted. I mean, that we know for the rapid onset that it is mostly females that are affected. And that could be the view of a female. I don't know if you want to comment anything.
We discussed we discussed that there is a paradox in the liberation of women, that a lot of girls still feel restricted in the norms about how a woman is, and simply don't want to fit into that role.
Thank you. Sorry. Do you have more questions or comments? Would you like to? Yes, please.
You mentioned, Johanna, that okay. You mentioned, Johanna, that the 1st of May there was a change at Karolinska, and I wonder how was it possible before that to, without proper research and scientific basis, introduce a treatment in young individuals with lifelong consequences, irreversible surgery, and long-term endocrinology treatment. How was that possible? Are there any other examples that medical science has gone so far without any evidence?
You are correct. This is really the issue, that in a way these things happen so rapidly. Within 5-10 years something happened and we didn't really realize what happened. And most of my colleagues in endocrinology, they say that it's the psychiatric's fault. We just do what we are set to do. But this is really the matter, that we have to have enough evidence and science behind the thing that we do. And I know that it has even happened that children before the age of 15 have been performed surgery. And a female that went on in Stockholm, and that is against the law. But you know that just some years ago, our government in Sweden tried to decrease the age where that could be possible. So we have to be aware that it's really a confusion. It's a societal confusion that we have to handle. Magnus, please.
Well, this is the last minute, and I won't take all of it, but I was so surprised when your YouTube lecture, Peter, went away, because I listened to it before it went away and was censored by YouTube. And then you mentioned that this book, that Amazon considered it as hate speech or whatever, and then it went away. And then we had in the pediatric magazine in Sweden, we have a little magazine, and there was a book review about the Macchiarini affair at Karolinska. But nothing has been written about what has passed now lately, which is basically research fraud on a gigantic scale, and it should enrage people, because this is really pulling away the rug under science and facts, if facts doesn't matter. So, Peter, what is the discussion in the medical community in England as a whole? How is it possible that professional organizations can sign papers about policy without even reading? I mean, we are supposed to know what we are publishing in scientific journals, but that isn't longer the case, and this is research fraud, nothing else. Can you please comment about that?
Well, I agree with you. And what's happening here is that scientific research is becoming politicized, and the ideology is controlling what can and can't be said. And it's extraordinary what happened in the UK, because the Royal College of Psychiatrists had a small group who were looking into this, and it was led by someone who was an LGBT activist. And it seemed that everybody was afraid to say anything. And so they produced this guidance, and then they went around to all of the different medical bodies, and everybody just lined up and signed it, apparently without reading it. And I think at a biblical level, we'd call it the fear of man, that people are afraid to say what they think because of what might happen to them in terms of their loss of freedom of speech. And yet it's only been through people being willing to stand up and take the risk that the tide has turned. And some of these folk have been the ones you wouldn't expect. Lesbian and gay activists have been some of the most stridently outspoken against what's happening in the transgender world at the moment. But it just shows, they say the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, that we have to stand up for the freedoms that we have, or we will lose them. And I think what we're seeing in a sense with this whole movement is what has been called cultural Marxism. It's the same kind of idea that you have to comply by holding a certain set of beliefs and saying certain things, and if you don't, then there are going to be penalties in terms of loss of privilege, whether it's your freedom of speech or your job or your right to assemble or whatever. So I think at a spiritual level, what we're really seeing is what the Apostle Paul referred to as a great delusion. It's people come to believe a lie and hold it passionately against the evidence and seem not open to persuasion. And so there's this spiritual level of being deluded and the fear of man, which plays into this. And our medical institutions and our colleagues are not immune from these influences. So we've got to be very wary about scientific research becoming politicized and becoming an instrument of an ideology or of the state.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this seminar. And thank you. Yes?
Very short comment. About your question, Thomas. James Cantor is a Canadian sex researcher, and he has written some about this subject and sees many analogies between this rapid increase in gender dysphoria and the concept of suppressed memories and the way this idea rapidly affected psychiatric practice and legal institutions, which is interesting, I think, to compare.
Thank you. So then we close this seminar and thank everybody for sharing here. Thanks. So thank you, Peter. Bye.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless, Peter.